Hello and welcome back to the Comic Books Matter podcast. I am your host, Jesse, and with me today is an amazing guest. He dabbles in writing about video games, computers, wrestling, and much more. It's Chris Edgerton.
Oh, wow. You actually said my name right the very first time without prompting.
The reasoning for this is, what now I don't even remember his. Oh, it's Joel Edgerton has the same last name,
Yes,
and so
yes. And
I hear his name
yeah,
all the time in interviews. So I just remember that's how that's pronounced.
yeah. And it's literally like been the saving grace because I can go to people now and be like that guy.
Yeah.
Like how that guy says it, that's how it's said. Because people growing up in school got it wrong constantly all the time.
Yeah, because I know I would say like it's Edgerton for some reason because your brain just switches letters when you read it. But yeah.
Yeah, it's not great, but thank you so much for getting my name right first time,
Oh,
first try.
I try my best. So Chris, though, I'm happy to have you on here. You came to me kind of unprompted. Usually, I have to go reach out to people, but you came to me and you're like, "Hey, I have this book I want to talk about. I'm excited about it, and have you heard of it?" And I had no idea what the book was, which is always fun for me.
Yeah,
And I was able to read through all of it last night. So I'm glad. I was worried I wasn't going to be able to get enough in because I was just busy with a lot of other stuff.
yeah,
But I was able to get it, able to dig through it, and I am upset that there's only one volume because it ends on a weird cliffhanger.
yeah, and we'll get into that in a little bit as we talk about sort of the arc of this book and this writer and what it was like for me reading this month to month, with all the excellent cliffhangers that are in this book.
Yeah. So the book is No One Left to Fight by Aubrey. Now, see, I might mess up these last names. Sister Son, and Figo Osio,
Aubrey Sitterson and
Sitterson. Okay,
Fico, I think it's Ozio.
Ozio. That makes sense.
It might be Ozio. I am really, really bad with the pronunciation. I should have checked before this episode, but I did not. I totally had the opportunity, but I did not, and I apologize.
Yeah, and letters done by Taylor Esposito, and looks like more other colors done by Rachel Vila. Just to make sure everybody gets their credit. But those are all the people on the book. But before we jump into the book, Chris, how did you get into comic books in general?
So comic books for me, I mostly came to them kind of sideways because I came to them through like the television and the video games of the 90s and very early 2000s. Like it was very much like I didn't actually read comic books, but I knew about things from the I knew about Ben Reilly because of the Never Saw Spider-Man game, right? Like
Yeah, yeah.
so there was just a bunch of other like ancillary ancillary media out at the time that was just like Marvel stuff and like a little bit of DC stuff that was just around like video games and TV, like
Mm-hmm.
when I when I was like 10, it was when Smallville premiered, like 2002, 2003.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like superhero stuff has always sort of been in my purview. I just never it's not that I never ever read comics, but I just never got into the habit of like picking up comics because
Yeah, for sure.
it was definitely one of those things of like I lived in an area where there weren't comic book shops, but there also weren't like local libraries like super close to me. So it's like
Mm-hmm.
kind of just didn't really ever think about it.
And when the digital comics market basically hit in like the early 2010s, like did you jump on that right away, or did you kind of ease into that too?
Not right away. It took me a couple years to get into Marvel Unlimited. I didn't really get in until like 2017, 2018, type of like looking at like just other like actual like comic book stuff.
Yeah.
So I'm like fairly new, but comics, and especially when you talk about the big two, like comics have a big lore, and it's literally like a Bible.
Yeah.
where where once you pick at one thread, it all threads back to one thing, which then threads back to 7 other things. So it's easy to sort of keep digging and
Yeah.
just find the stuff you want to find, I guess.
I'm glad you didn't find that super daunting, because I know that happens to a lot of people, which is 100% understandable, because 80 years of anything in general is daunting. Um, but to be able to hear the confidence of just kind of pulling on the threads and just finding the thread that you like the most, and so learning about that is really, I feel like, the best way to go about getting into comics.
Yeah, and it's still hard because it's still like we don't think about it much because like we grew up doing it in school, but reading is very much like a discipline, right?
Yeah.
And so you like have to just keep reading if like that's your goal. And especially for me, as somebody who is very I wouldn't say averse to like regular reading, but I think about like deeper like philosophy stuff I want to get into, and that's like just very thick text. And like comic books are a good way to like warm up because like it's not so text heavy that you're like you are reading like stories, but they're not like 70 pages thick of like all
Hmm.
this different stuff. It's like quick little sentences and you can understand what's going on.
Yeah, it's weird thing about, but reading, you're really flexing a muscle in your brain to like understand and comprehend. So if you don't keep practicing with reading, you kind of get lethargic in it. With any kind of like trait that takes some kind of skill. I mean, reading reading is a skill in some ways, but also it's a thing that people just do eventually.
Yeah.
It just depends. But yeah, like if you don't keep reading, you're definitely going to get lazy in what you do read.
Yeah.
It does help if you read a lot, that it helps you gain the level to get to the harder topics.
Yeah. Definitely.
So what got you to No One Left to Fight? Because it's a dark horse book, so it definitely fits in the more independent markets. So how'd you weave your way into it?
So this is an interesting story. I knew the writer Aubrey Sitterson because he used to do PR for the WWE video games,
Oh, okay.
and then he went on to like after uh, he left 2K because when THQ bought that part of, or when 2K bought that part of THQ, they were like moving the studio up to Northern California or like up out of LA, right?
Hmm.
Because THQ was in LA, uh, and they were moving out of there. So he started a wrestling podcast because he was super into wrestling, and I got to know him through there, sort of how you've gotten to know the Uppercut folks
Yeah.
just through like Patreon, and just you end up just talking to people a bunch, and you do that for 3+ years, and you start to just develop relationships with people. And so he's become like I, I I'm not gonna say like a super close friend, but like
Yeah. Hmm.
we correspond pretty regularly. So he was definitely like the driving force with this book. He's done other stuff like Street Fighter versus GI Joe is super good. Uh, but yeah, No One Left to Fight is definitely probably my favorite.
No, knowing that he's written a Street Fighter comic, even if it is Street Fighter versus GI Joe, that makes a whole lot of sense. There's very much, very very close to copyright infringement, Street Fighter things happening in his book sometimes.
Yeah, but you know that's I mean flattery is the what is that saying? Imitate.
Imitations of a sincerest form of flattery.
Yeah. So it's
Yeah, no, and I agree. And like the thing about it is, FICO doing the art on it too is, it's some of the best independent art that I never knew about, which
yeah,
is really surprising.
yeah, man. This was 90% of the reason that I wanted to talk to you about this book, because this book made me understand why people get so particular about art,
Mm-hmm.
because Fico's art here, man, is just I will never find something that hits me the way that this hits me the first time I looked at it. Like there's never going to be anything like that for me again.
Yeah, I
Like
mean, it really does pack a punch even in the first few pages.
it's just like, even looking at my trade today, I was like, holy crap. Like there were just little tiny details and little flourishes that I just never noticed as I was reading this month to month. But it's just so bright and so powerful and so just honest to God, just unlike anything I've ever looked at.
Yeah, one of my biggest things I look for in art, just because it's one of my favorite features, is always facial expressions. Like Kevin McGuire is one of my favorite artists because of his just the stuff he does with facial gags all the time. And honestly, like there's a lot of flashiness going on in this, but the emotion that he puts in all the faces is something that I think is overlooked in a lot of books. But like this is still very important that this book has such good like emotional tells within the faces.
Yeah, it's really, 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 really good.
So basically, the premise, from what I understand, I only read it once, so if there's deeper layers, I do not know them yet. Is basically hero comes back to town from saving the world multiple times, and basically he's not well, and he's trying to get well mentally, and he's meeting with his ex and his brother and his kids that he left behind, and it keeps getting worse for him.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, and that's easy to pick to pick apart, like like when you read it as a trade, but definitely month to month that there was a lot of stuff, because you're coming at this, like this world is a world that's already happened.
Yeah.
So
Mm-hmm.
so you're coming at this story 20 years down the line, trying to figure out like who these people are, like who is really the bad guy here,
Yeah.
like, and and it and see, this is why I love this book, is because 99% of the time I hate stories like this.
Yeah, me too.
I hate things that start this way and don't fill in the backstory, but here it just, there's such a, it it's not even a mystery to it, but just a sort of wonderment, like a sense of grandeur around the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
That the entire time that you're reading it, you're just like picking up these little tiny pieces, and they're just little tiny nuggets of things that just might show up in the future, and you have no idea. But you're like you're actively retaining it in a way,
Yeah.
and it's super, super interesting.
Yeah, and it's one of, as you said, like they don't ever really fill in the blanks. There's a few context clues that fill in some blanks, and there's some things you do need to know that it does give you. But like the overall backstory, it just isn't there. And after the first issue, I was a little upset about it. But by the time you reach the end of the trade, you're like, okay, I'm here for what this story is now, because the past is really what doesn't matter. It's what matters what's happening to him right now.
Yeah, yeah, and there was, and I'll link it to you so you can put it in in the show notes. I'll find it. There was like a, when they announced the comic for Dark Horse, they did like an Entertainment Weekly
Mm-hmm.
cover that was like like a 3-page mini story that like was sort of filling in those first gaps, but
Interesting.
they I they don't put it in the trade, which is like interesting business stuff probably, but
Yeah, there's probably some kind of license there that they didn't sort out first off.
yeah.
So what about this book in particular though is the reason, like what, other than like it being beautiful and it being really well written for a story that just throws you into the deep end real fast, what about it in particular was something that you were like, I need to talk about this book in particular?
Just because I really like the idea that this is a, we talked about it in the beginning of this episode, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
comics is such a big and grand and wide thing, and there's 80 years of history, and why would anyone, where do I even start? Like, this is a fully, totally self-contained 5-issue trade that you can pick up, and more people should know about it,
Yeah.
because like that rules. The fact that like this is just its own story, and you don't have to know anything else, and it's an honest to God number one. That's I've like gone down the Marvel rabbit hole so many times of like looking at different number ones, and then like finding out that like, oh, this number one isn't really a number one. It's much more like a 25 that they just put a 1 on because they needed to get numbers or whatever. You know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. And like, even the ending that ends on a pretty massive cliffhanger overall. Once I finished it and I tried to like do research and try to figure out if there's going to be more, and I don't know for sure if there's going to be more. Even though I knew that like if that was where it ended, I was okay with it being there.
Yeah, they. So I'm not blowing the lid off of anything here, because Aubrey's talked about this publicly, so I can talk about it. They definitely want there to be more. They say they have at least like three volumes planned. Like, they're like pot committed on this thing. They just need for everything to work out, and for the business side of it to like play out. And
that's always the struggle with independent books too, is a lot of the time, even if you find a publisher, they're still being self-funded in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And I don't know anything about about the actual like business side of it, or what's done and what's not done. So I won't speak to that, but I definitely will say like they want there to be more, and they have plans, and they've talked about like, oh, here's what we would like. What, like, this is like the present arc, right? And
Yeah.
and so but then there's also like a past arc and a future arc, and they've talked about like how they want to do that, and can expand things that way. So
Yeah. And like, this world is ripe for expansion and like mining if they wanted to. But at the same time, as we talked about previously, like, they don't need to. Like, you get enough in this first trade to be satisfied with the world overall, as long as the main story keeps pushing forward.
yeah.
The other thing I think was super interesting, and it goes kind of to one of the Q&A questions I wrote too, is the idea of his mental health deteriorating throughout the book. When it comes to representation of disabilities or mental health, or just anything of that kind of sort of things that we see day to day or we deal with day to day, but they're just not represented very much in comics, or if they do, they're really poorly represented. I think this is a case of it representing kind of PTSD really well.
Yeah. And
yeah.
and that's something, and I'll say this just because I have regular experience with it. Aubrey will regularly reach out to the people he needs to reach out to when doing this sort of stuff. Like, he definitely does due diligence. I would say definitely goes above and beyond from what I've seen in terms of the way that he represents different kinds of characters.
And that's like, I think that's half the battle. Is most of the time people don't do the research, right? Like, they don't do the actual talking to people who deal with these issues to get the real. They'll read like the text, but they won't ask the people, right?
Yeah.
Because I think about how when you read just even like business things, right? Daredevil, from anybody else's perspective, seems kind of hokey when he's in the law offices, but when he was written by Charles Soule, who was a lawyer, when he's in the law offices, it feels like an actual lawyer,
right?
Because the guy knew he was there, he's been there. So I think actually getting people who've been in the situations or dealing with those situations, getting the information from them instead of from paper, is what's important.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think too, I think about like the fact that like Krista's like technically an amputee, but it never has to come up in the book.
Mm-hmm.
But like it does, but it could, also
Yeah.
like there are seeds there, and it's like represented well, and it's not, and it's also like not represented like, oh, like hokey magical savior, like you know what I mean? Like
Yeah. Hmm.
it could have easily gone that route, but it didn't, and it's just really, really good. And also, like, talking about like things I didn't notice until I read literally today, like Krista's headband, like it's headphones, so she
Hmm.
must be listening to something, and I want to know so badly, like, what is she listening to? Like, what is on her iPod?
Yeah, and like, what is it always on because that's how the only way she can focus is that the only way she can mute everybody out all the time?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
it's yeah,
Yeah, and
definitely interesting.
I am just surprised. Like that's the thing about comic books too. In a lot of ways, is I'm just surprised there's so much out there that I don't know, and when people just throw it my way, it's so much fun to find something new like this.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's what's great about it too, and that's why, like, I said, like, all I wanted for this episode was for you to be aware of this book, and I've done my job. So
Yeah,
it's like, yeah, we're totally good. Like if like nothing ever happens again, like at least this book, like about this book and about Aubrey. So I've like done my job in terms of like what I feel like I was put on this earth to do, which is tell people about rad
yeah,
stuff.
and I appreciate you coming on to talk about just a rad book. Um, so not to cut this conversation short, but to move on to Q&A, because this is a few things I'm actually super curious to get your perspective on in general, right?
Yeah,
And we touched upon it briefly with one of the characters in the book. When it comes to representation of disabilities in comics, there's two ways people tend to handle them, and I don't know if either one of them is the right way. One is the disability is a hindrance. I think that's definitely the wrong way, because yeah, it can be a hindrance, but it doesn't really define completely who someone is in that way. But at the other side, you have characters like Daredevil or even Hawkeye in some ways where they make it so it's a skill, and I also don't know if that's fully the way to do it.
yeah. I think part of what it is there has to be an honesty in that hindrance.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I think it does sort of have to be there, but it's also like not necessarily a thing that has to like put them out of commission.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's a thing that they have to deal with, and some people are great at dealing with their disability and some people are not, and that's like why it's a spectrum and why people with disabilities are not a monolith, because
Yeah.
like literally every person's experience is going to be different. Like so like as much as I like wish that we had more than Professor X and Oracle and Daredevil, like I love all those characters for different reasons, because that's like part of who they are. Like they
Mm-hmm.
are who they are, like I think about like Char- Charles's ability to be passive and like not as militant as Magneto probably comes from the fact that he doesn't like trust his physical body,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
Like
Yeah.
so like I I do think that like there it's a it's a tricky battle, and again this is probably why you should just hire disabled writers,
Mm-hmm.
because we know this stuff more than able-bodied folks do, and so you should hire them to write books or consult as editors or something,
Yeah.
because
No, I agree.
yeah.
And for the next question though is like, what's your biggest pet peeves in comics? It doesn't have to be focused on just like how people are represented, but just in general, like what are things you're just tired of?
um I am peeved by the way that the I guess market, I talked about it before, but the way that we sort of reissue number one to everything
Yeah.
when it doesn't need to be in it. Like I understand why Marvel would be averse to pulling a DC and having there be like 700 more Spider-Man comics. Like I get
Yeah.
it, but like I just need to for it to be all in a line
Yeah.
to read, because that's what it's meant to do. It's meant to be read in order, and it's also not like my opinion doesn't have to be like the one that governs comics. Like people can read however they want, wherever they want.
Yeah.
Like as, as long as you don't pirate it, like we're cool. Like
Yeah.
just uh you know. But it for me, the biggest pet peeve is like picking up a new number one and then realizing, oh, this isn't where I actually wanted to start. I
Yeah.
wanted to start at this like 2014 series 2 years before this. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, the idea that every comic should be someone's first comic, but at the same time, if you're trying to read things in order, renumbering does get very messy because you can have 6 number ones in 6 years, depending on who's publishing.
yeah,
And yeah,
and and even just going through the like Marvel Unlimited, just the web client of it took me half an hour to find like the actual uh original Bendis like Miles stuff.
yeah,
And even then, I had to go back and read Ultimate Fallout, which was the actual setup where Peter actually dies, and I had to like go and find that.
yeah. I think there was another example too of Jason Aaron's Thor that introduces Jane Foster Thor. And I think that book goes through 3 or 4 number ones, even though it's the same story from front to back.
Yeah,
So like if you start on the number one though, in the middle of the run, you're gonna be a little lost and not get the beginning of that story.
yeah, and that sucks because that's not even necessarily Jason Aaron's fault, right? Like
No, yeah,
that's
I don't think he makes that decision.
yeah. So like, what? That's also another pet peeve is like, and that's why this book is great, because you can tell by the writing and the art that this is a co-creation,
Yeah,
right? Like this is fully 100% like not just Aubrey writing and Fico doing art, but it's totally a collaboration between the two, and that's why it works.
yeah,
And like that's what comics should be, is an actual collaboration and not this assembly line $1 million corporation. But
yeah.
we're
No, I
already
agree.
past the pale on that, so we're kind of stuck.
And then lastly, what is the idea of a realistic superhero so kind of weird? Because people always compare like, well, you could be Batman. Well, you can only be Batman if you're rich and have the lifespan to learn every fighting technique and scientific discovery within your 10 years before you're 25. Um, and like even like Spider-Man, you have to be bit by a radioactive spider and be really good at science. Or even Hawkeye, like you just have to be very skilled with a bow and arrow. It's like, what is the idea of a realistic superhero? Is there such a possibility? Because there has to be some skill that's superhuman, right?
Uh, I yeah, I guess I don't really know the answer to that question, because also then what is the role of a superhero?
Yeah,
Is the role of a superhero to fight crime, or is it just to make people's lives better,
yeah,
or is it like like there's 7,000 different ways to to answer that question. So like I don't know, like yeah, like there's a there's a part of me that wants to be like, oh, like doctors and nurses especially, um, but I don't know. Like I feel like learning anything, even
hmm
video games, like takes a certain amount of skill. Like you have to commit time to whatever you do. So
yeah,
it's like, and you know, like yeah, I don't know. That kind of threw me sideways because I was such a different question.
yeah. I try to throw one of those curveballs in just to get people thinking about something a bit different.
What do you think? Like,
I think you kind of hit the nail on the head in the first part when you said, "What is the definition of what a superhero does?" Right?
yeah,
I think if a superhero is just fighting crime and making people's lives better, you can have people do that in a just way that our society thinks it, in a way, is military power or enforcement of law power, but it's not in a lot of ways. It's being able to see the gray and kind of parse through it,
Yeah.
and hopefully the correct way. The problem is there's always going to be someone who feels burned by that kind of justice, right?
Yeah.
And they're never going to see the superhero through that. But I think the idea of a superhero is a hero that can kind of parse through the gray areas and not be held to such a perfect standard of a law or an order.
Yeah. I think I think to a certain degree that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, Chris, like this for a topic about just getting a book in people's faces. Has actually been a very good topic of just uh, comics in general, but also like representation in books, I think.
Yeah.
And the thing is, the next thing I want to know is like, where can people find all of your hot takes on everything or your writing in general?
You can find me currently on Twitter at Wheels1993. That was the year I was born. You can find most of my writing at fix.space. Um, it's a site that's like run by 6 of my friends that I met on a Facebook group, and they let me write for them, and I've been on their podcast. So if you search Fix FYX space spoiler cast for either Spider-Man or Final Fantasy VII Remake, you will find me there talking about my video game BS. Yeah.
And for this podcast, you can find us on Twitter at Comics Matter Pod, Facebook, because we still have people who need to be on Facebook, I guess, at facebook.com/comicbooksmatter. You can email me at comicbooksmatter@gmail.com. And if you want to be a guest, have a story you want read on the air about why comics matter to you, or have any questions for future guests, you can contact me at all of those locations. Currently, after today, hopefully, if I have time, we will be putting a pause on the Patreon until I can figure out what I want to do with that, because I don't want to take anybody's money without putting extra content on there. And also, if you can, please rate and review wherever you find us, and tell friends about the show, because I want to grow the audience. I want to see this get further. Um, the logo of the show is done by my friend Steven, and the theme is Joy in a Restaurant by David Szesztay, and I found it on freemusicarchive.com. And remember, be good to each other, and Black Lives Matter.